Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc. I'm here today with Witold Rybczynski, who is an emeritus professor in the Graduate School of Fine Arts at the University of Pennsylvania, and also the author of, countless books. I only have a subset. How many books have you written?
I think 20-something, 22 maybe.
Yeah, 22. And I think the first one I got was called Home. And that was many, many, many years ago. And you did a lot of books, obviously, on architecture, including The Most Beautiful House in the World, a book called Looking Around, a book called The Perfect House on Palladio, a book called The Story of Architecture, which is kind of like a big history. And then a couple that I have with me here, How Architecture Works, A Humanist's Toolkit, City Life, Urban Expectations in a New World. And then, of course, you've also done a lot of stuff on development. So there's this one, Last Harvest, How a Cornfield Became New Daleville. And there's this one, A Clearing in the Distance, which I loved, about Olmsted. And then you've done a couple little micro histories, one on the chair, this one on the screwdriver. And the most recent book is about kind of the history of car design. So you've been all over the place, anything to do with design, architecture, etc. Welcome, Vit.
Yes.
Well, look, I don't know where to start. I guess one question I would have for you is, we seem to make this distinction between the fine arts and the applied arts. And architecture, design of things like cars and chairs and so forth, seem to fit in the latter category. And I've always wondered why we make this distinction. I was lucky enough to live in a Frank Lloyd Wright house for 3 years. And I just couldn't figure out why this house was worth less than a Picasso drawing. Because you might look at the Picasso drawing maybe an hour a week or so. You might walk past it on the way to the bathroom. But if you're living in a Frank Lloyd Wright house, you're aware of it 24 hours a day, right? You're aware of it even like while you're sleeping. And so why is it that we, value these applied arts less than we value the fine arts?
Well, it's a good question, and I think it's a cultural decision. Remember, in the Renaissance, if you were a painter, it was assumed that you could also design a building. And so there was a formal profession of painting, but there was no formal profession of architecture, and painters and sculptors and engravers, in the case of Brunelleschi, designed buildings and did very well at it. On the other hand, when I wrote the story of architecture, and I had to dig into Chinese architecture a little bit, which is really an interesting and great tradition of architecture. The Chinese did not actually have a word for architect. They did not recognize architecture at all, and never mind as an applied art. It was, a calligrapher or a poet or a musician was a recognized figure in the court. He had status. But an architect, they didn't call them architects, but the people who built the buildings were really craftsmen, and they were in the category of potters or weavers. They weren't considered artists at all. So it's very much a cultural decision whether, as you said, whether we say this painting is going to go for millions of dollars and this building is going to get demolished. It's in some ways arbitrary, but it's obviously important to the culture itself, and it probably says something about the values of the culture and so on. But I would argue that whether or not we consider architecture an applied art or not quite an art or some sort of art, buildings last an awful long time, and buildings have a kind of influence that art doesn't have because they're useful. So we can love them in one way, the way we love a painting. It makes us feel good to walk by a building. Maybe we never go into it, but we see it. But it also it may be as old as an ancient piece of art, but it's also useful. We actually use it. So we have an attachment to it the way you have an attachment to tools or utensils or practical things. And that makes architecture different than art. And I would argue it's not a question of which one comes first, but it's certainly a different type of art. And also, as I think Nicholas Pevsner observed, you don't have to look at art. You can avoid going to the museum. You don't have to go to a concert, but you have to look at architecture. And often you have to use it, because if you want to go to a lecture, you have to go into that building. Or if you want to travel, you have to go through the train station. So architecture is different also in art, in the sense that it kind of imposes itself on people, which in one way gives architects a sort of responsibility, which is different than the artist. The architect can't just say, well, I'm doing it because I like it and I don't care what you think. For a public building, that's a very reckless kind of a statement.
Yeah, well, if I could go one step further, I mean, if we move from the level of the architect to the level of the city planner, right? I mean, if we think about someone like Baron Haussmann, or even like Frederick Law Olmsted, I mean, it seems like they're one level further down in the status hierarchy, but they have an even more profound impact, I think, on our lives. And we were just discussing how this field of city planning may not even be housed in a school of art. Right? Sometimes it's found in business schools, and God forbid, is seen as just all about money and business, but it can, or politics, but it's clearly has a huge impact on our lives, an aesthetic impact.
Yes, yeah. You mentioned I wrote a biography of Frederick Law Olmsted, and I'm not a landscape architect, and it was sort of my introduction in some ways to the whole field. And I realized that landscape architects have it much worse than architects, because everybody thinks they can be a gardener. I mean, it's not and so things, the landscape architect designs a park, and then people move things around. 50 years later, the trees get changed, or they decide. Olmsted, for example, was not at all enamored of flowers. There are no flowers in his parks, for example. And there's a quote in the book. So a lady asked him, where are we going to put the flower beds? And he said, anywhere except in the park. And so, but then people love flowers, and they say, oh, wouldn't it be nice to have flowers? And they completely change the landscape that the landscape architect has worked so hard to create. So it's actually a much tougher profession than architecture, because it's easier to change things. It's sort of hard. It's impossible to change city plans because they're legal, that people own property, and they're legal property lines and public rights of way and all of that. So once the planner does his job, it's very hard to change it. And architecture is not as hard, but it's difficult. You have to tear things down, and it's expensive and disruptive. But you're quite right. Landscape city planning affects things, and it affects them in this permanent way. After a war, we rebuild the buildings, but the street layout stays the same, because it's so difficult. There were all these plans after the Great Fire of London to make London a sort of Rome or Paris. But then they realized you can't do it. You have to start building right away, and the streets are already there. And it was rebuilt, not architecturally, but planning-wise, exactly the same as it had been.
Well, this book, City Life, I mean, you've got a picture on the cover of a Parisian street scene, but the book is really kind of a defense of the American city. Right?
Yes.
So, I think when you moved to the U.S., you said you were moving to Philadelphia, and they said, well, why would you ever want to do that? And most people who go to a place like Paris say, why can't every city be like Paris? But, a city like Philadelphia, I lived there for many years. I actually really liked it. I found that there were certain aspects of the American city which were really wonderful. So, I mean, what is distinctive about the American city? And I don't mean sort of with the car, but going all the way
Yeah.
back to de Tocqueville, it seemed like there was something distinctive about the American city.
Oh, there were many things. One of them is that we had no history. We arrive in this continent. There are Native Americans living here, but they, by and large, don't build anything like a city or even towns. And so we're starting from scratch. And secondly, it's a really big place, so we tend to spread out. There are no limits the way there. In Europe, most cities had to do with the middle, which say go back to the Middle Ages. It had to do with defense, and you couldn't spread out too much. Plus, the lord of the manor owned all the land around the city, so the cities became very concentrated and packed in, often behind a wall, because they had to protect themselves, often against the same aristocrats, because the city was not part of the sort of feudal system. It was where freedom begins. And we don't have any of that history. So our cities don't have limits except natural ones, like if they're on an island like Manhattan or but butting up against the Pacific Ocean. But otherwise, we tend to just spread out. So that was a very big difference. And also, when you start from scratch, you sort of you have to imagine these people arriving, and there's just a forest. So first of all, you have to cut the trees down to make some space, and the sort of artistic side of planning a city, you kind of put on the back burner because you're dealing with these immediate kind of crucial problems of just trying to get a foothold. And then, of course, we are an entrepreneurial society, and our cities reflect that. So we tended not to build great squares, and we didn't have kings and aristocrats who were building these rather splendid buildings in Europe, but we just don't have that. And it doesn't really start, well, it starts early enough. We do start to build city halls or courthouses, but it's when we build these commercial buildings, the skyscrapers, that we create something which you could truly say was American. It hadn't existed before, these vertical cities of towers. But the towers are not church steeples, they're commercial buildings, they're practical buildings. And so, yes, we have a very different idea of what we want in a city, of the history that forms the city. And we do, there's this moment when Americans start traveling more. People go to Europe especially, and they see the cities. And, by 1890s, America was one of the richest countries in the world, if not the largest economy in the world, certainly. And they went to Paris and London, and they were kind of ashamed. They said, we don't have anything like that. And we're rich and we're powerful and we're going to be a world power. We weren't quite yet, but we could see it coming. But we don't have cities that measure up. And so there was this moment where we try to do something like that. And it was often called the City Beautiful movement. And Washington is a result of that, most of monumental Washington. And certain buildings, cultural centers in, say, San Francisco, or city halls are built around the country, state capitals. But it doesn't last. At one point, we sort of run out of energy or steam or something. And that great moment, and it is a great moment, those are the buildings that people love to have and look at and visit and so on. But it's sort of, we go back to something more practical, and we don't spend as much as our ancestors did on those buildings. And we don't spend as much money or as much time worrying about what they're like. We sort of regress to a more practical, an earlier moment like the colonial period, where people were not investing in these really grand plans and so on.
Well, it seems like American cities are also built to scale, right? So, you set up this grid, and, the grid can go in every direction almost infinitely, and it makes it really, really easy to navigate. I mean, cities that have numbered streets, it's kind of boring to Europeans, but you never have any trouble figuring out how to get from point A to point B. And I'm always amazed that when new cities were formed, they would just copy the street names of the cities that they came from, so that newcomers could easily figure out, right, which way was north and south.
And,
That seems unique.
There's another thing which Americans often forget, I find. I'm originally English, then Canadian, and now American. But Americans forget this is a really big country. I mean, other than Russia and China, there aren't any countries as big as the United States. And so, most European countries have one major city, and that's it. And France has Paris, and then the next city is way smaller and less important and really in a different category altogether. Similarly, in England, London is London, and then there are other big cities, but they're in a separate category. And we have many big cities. We have 3 or 4, arguably maybe 4 or 5 even leading cities. And at various times we've had more. I mean, Detroit was a major city. Even Buffalo, New York was an important city. And that's very different than having one big city, because the cities are all competing. And cities like Detroit, which are very important at one moment, become much less important. They become smaller, they lose their industry, whatever happens, because we have competition between cities. And most countries don't have that. Nobody competes with Paris. Paris is Paris. And Italy may be a little bit different, because Milan is the center of many things where that Rome is not the center of. And that's a result, of course, of its history, which is different than most European countries. But generally speaking, it's an important factor. I mean, you put that together with the mobility of people, and then you realize, on the one hand, as you said, cities copy each other because something becomes successful in one place, and there's a High Line in New York, and everybody wants to do something like the High Line, which of course usually doesn't work, but it's the result of having so many cities which are constantly jostling each other, trying to attract people, attract money, attract investment, and attract employment, all those things. It's tough to be an American city. It's not that you don't have any guarantees.
Well, there's another distinction, which I think de Tocqueville made, which is that there isn't really a clear distinction between urban and non-urban in the U.S. the way there was historically in Europe, right? You were, the citizen of the city, right? You were a bourgeois or you were a peasant, and we never really had that distinction. Everybody's kind of urban in a way, even when they're living in a farm.
Yeah, so New Yorkers think that they're different, but they're actually not really different, and to some extent. Certainly in the past, things, small cities didn't have museums and they didn't have access to many things. But if there's a trend in the modern age, things get spread out. So because of media like television and internet and so, the difference between a small town or a smallish city and a large city is not as big as it used to be. You can buy the same things wherever you live. You can live at a village and you can have access to so many of the things that somebody living in Manhattan does. So the trend certainly is to homogenize people, so that basically, well, God knows we're not homogenized today, but that's for different reasons. That's mainly political and, to a certain extent, values, which have perhaps questioned sort of the idea that we're all the same, and said, no, we're not all the same. You don't agree with me on this, and I don't agree with you on that. So maybe we've exaggerated some of those similarities, but in general, there is certainly, as you said, there isn't these urban and rural cultures that we have in other countries.
Well, in America also, it seems like we have much less of a sense of place, right? So, if you wake up in an American city, you're traveling on business and you wake up and it's you look out the window, you don't really know where you are, right? And in Europe, it's almost always obvious. Although increasingly, I think business travelers, they like to stay in, the Hiltons and the Hyatts of the world because the bedrooms are exactly the same and the
Yes.
furnishings are exactly the same, and they don't know where they are. I hate that. When I travel, I try to, if I'm going to go to a country, I want to find a hotel that reminds me every minute when I'm in that room that I'm in that country. But it seems like in America, what does it even mean to have like a Cincinnati, style or Kansas City
Well, I
style?
think I'm not sure I would agree with you completely because on the one hand, it's a very big country and we're all Americans, so you would expect people to be similar. But you do have regional differences. Oh, you have different people speak with different accents, and it's more pronounced in some parts of the country than others. So uh, clearly, the South is still very different, and then it extends into food and various other things. So I think sometimes we exaggerate the idea of similarity because I think there really are differences, different traditions. Uh, Certainly, architecturally, there are different traditions, and uh, partly because I think we move around so much that there is a blending. So that I mean, I wrote a book about Charleston and present day Charleston, mostly a little bit of history. And I think most of the protagonists in this, it's a nonfiction book, but it follows a group of people. I think only a handful of them are sort of second, third, or fourth generation Charlestonians. Most of them are people who have come to Charleston from somewhere else. They've spent their whole life there at this point, but they're not born there and they're not Southerners in that sense. So, and I think that's probably true all over the country. At the same time, Charleston is not like other places. It's very different. It's got its own sort of strange customs and values and uh, ways of doing things. Some of which have created this sort of a beautiful and very un-American city in the sense it's a downtown, for instance, without high-rise buildings. That's very un-American. Most American cities, at one point or another, the downtowns get transformed, and that never happened to Charleston, and it didn't happen because of a decision. They didn't want it, and they arranged things to avoid it. So that there are these, I admit, odd exceptions, but they sort of add up around the country in different ways. And uh, if you live next to the Pacific Ocean, it does change you. It makes life different. It makes your values different. It's inevitable. So I think there are more differences than we sometimes see, or we see the changes, which of course happen around the world, as you said. I mean, they're happening in Europe as much as here, arguably more,
Well, I mean,
because Europe has truly established cultures, which we never did. We were an immigrant culture from the beginning. But the Europeans were not, and now they suddenly have to deal with the sort of immigration that we've dealt with always, and they're not doing a great job.
well, I mean, do you think that the mobility that we have in America changes the way in which we think about home? Right? I mean, I did a podcast recently where I learned that the typical American would move every 3 years, right? This was sometimes every year. And I mean, I've been in like 40 homes over my lifetime. Does that mean that we think about home, the physical home, differently than folks in Europe who will oftentimes live in intergenerational homes, right? That they inherited from their grandparents and great grandparents.
Oh, I'm sure we think differently than Europeans do. I mean, for example, we build houses out of wood. Outside of Scandinavia, no European would would see a wooden house as being solid enough. A house has to be masonry because it's somehow culturally it's unacceptable. And then I think I looked into this once when I was living in Canada. I mean, Canada produces a lot of lumber, and they were trying to establish a foothold in Europe, and they never succeeded because Europeans just were not interested. They knew that the houses were cheaper and all of that, but they weren't just not interested in, and of course Scandinavia is a very small market, so that wasn't. But other than Scandinavia, Europeans build out of brick and masonry and sort of heavy materials. They don't build the way we do. So there are lots of cultural differences about what a home is. On the other hand, I would, we've just had Thanksgiving where millions of Americans go home. And there's a strong sense of this is, where you're born, where your parents are living. Maybe it's an illusion because usually when the parents die, that shifts and maybe the oldest child becomes the place where people go. But it does suggest that it's an important part of the culture nevertheless. Maybe different in some ways, but not absent, certainly.
Well, you lived for many years in Chestnut
Yes.
Hill, and it's one of my favorite communities, right? And it does seem in some ways archaic, but I think some developers are trying to reproduce the feel that you get. I mean, you have a walkable community, you have people with different socioeconomic status living side by side, your relatively short commute to Center City or downtown. I mean, this was actually the result of planning, right? Woodward
Yes.
and his colleagues, they designed this. And yet it doesn't seem designed, right? So, I mean, is this something that modern developers are looking at and learning from?
Well, there's a whole new urbanism movement that certainly takes a lot of its cues from the sort of 19th century development and as models in a sense. Because I gave a talk once in Chestnut Hill at the Conservancy, and I started by reminding them that we live in a real estate development. That's how it all started. It looks natural. It looks like it sort of grew organically, but it didn't. It was planned. It had financial foundations. It wasn't a philanthropic project. On the other hand, the developer had some ideals which were not purely financial, and he was very influenced, for example, by the movement from primarily in England, the Garden City movement, and so he hired young architects, but he would send them to England to learn about that and used it as a model. So many of the houses that he built at the time are based on things that were sort of happening in England. It was, of course, a different time. For instance, he built almost exclusively initially rental housing. People didn't buy the house, they rented, and that was sort of, these are big, expensive houses, not necessarily small. It wasn't an economic thing. And today, of course, we've become so tied to the idea of home ownership that the idea that you might spend your life in a rented house where the rent doesn't increase, by the way. I've talked to older people living in Woodward houses. They never increased the rent for years and years and years. At one point, I think the accountants got on the case and said, "You can't do this. You got to pay for maintenance and so on." But it was a different time, and I think some of the things are not reproducible because times have changed too much, and the outlook of the Woodwards, of course, still own property, large amounts of property in Chestnut Hill. So the whole idea of investing in a community and assuming you would be there for generations, that's a kind of difficult concept to think of in the 21st century. There are some places that are similar. It's an odd example, but Aspen, for instance, is developed by developers who have been there for generations and see their investment as a sort of very long-term thing, not something that you sort of buy in and sell out very quickly. So there are some examples, but by and large, that's also something from the early 20th century that's gone by the board.
Well, look, a lot of your work is about history. And you said somewhere, I think in the architecture book, that architects look backward in order to move forward. Well, what is the role of historical consciousness in architecture? I mean, obviously there are some folks that are just trying to flush the past and start from scratch. You know, Corbusier, I think, is probably among them. But I mean, to what extent does a good architect need to understand the history of his or her profession?
Well, as you said, there are architects. You mentioned Corbusier, but I would say Frank Gehry, for instance, once talked about the burden of history. Not the gift of history, but the burden. And certainly his buildings are not interested in history at all. Traditionally, architects were, and I think the reason was buildings lasted so long that, modern architects sometimes say we need an architecture of our time, which sounds kind of convincing. Yeah, you should have. I mean, we don't wear wigs anymore, and we don't wear the same clothes that the colonial people wore. So what shouldn't we have modern buildings? But then you realize that if you live in Philadelphia, admittedly an older city, you might go to a concert in a building that's 100 and something years old. You go to a museum, it's built in 1930. You go to the train station, it's built so your modern life takes place in all these old buildings, and that's certainly true in Europe. It's true increasingly in more and more American cities where, a building from 1920 is now 100 years old. So that changes the architectural profession because people like these old buildings. They use them, they're used to them. And so in the past, that has always affected architecture. So architects could invent things, but they couldn't invent from scratch because people just would not accept that. And so even if you were Michelangelo, you could do kind of radical things architecturally, but there were many things that you had to keep the memory of the way, what people expected a building to be and the way it worked, and that was not something that he upset. And so traditionally, our history has played a role. Similarly, in if you want to be a doctor, you don't have to learn the history of medicine. It would be pointless. You just want to know what's the latest thing that works. What are the things that really work? Not what did the witch doctors do, hundreds of years. But in architecture, you at least up to very recently, architects were taught history not as historians, but as practitioners. As the idea was somehow you needed to know because these things were they were models in a sense that architecture doesn't get better. There are newer buildings and they're newer, but the architecture of a new building isn't better just because it's newer. The elevators are better because they're newer. The lighting is better because it's newer. But architecturally, architecture, like art in a sense, and that's what it shares with art, it doesn't get better because it's newer. And I think that's a big disruption that happens sort of at the beginning of the 20th century, where some architects, in fact, some of the most talented architects, say, no, we don't need to look back anymore. We've done enough of that. We have to look forward, and maybe we can look at cars and steamships and planes. Maybe we can be inspired by bridges and what the engineers are doing, but we don't need to keep looking at what the Greeks and the Romans did. And that was a big change, a big shift. And whatever you can be critical of it, but the fact that it succeeded suggests that there were many things that people reacted positively to, especially after the Second World War. People were open to that. We forget that modern architecture was relatively popular. Less so in England, for instance, but in America, we liked it. We liked these buildings. They were clean and modern, and we didn't have buildings by Christopher Wren and all these people to look to. So we were less attached to history than the Europeans were. But the people celebrated modern architecture. They thought it was a great thing. Now, some of those things didn't turn out so well. I mean, concrete is not a great material. In fact, stone is better than concrete. It lasts longer. And a brick building can be maintained. You have to repoint the bricks periodically, but it basically is as good. It's almost as good as new. And an old concrete building is not. The concrete ages badly. I remember a wonderful saying, but Robert Stern, sadly just died. He was talking about buildings at Yale. He was dean at Yale, and he was in charge of renovating a building. And he said, these buildings cost pennies to build and millions to restore. And that's very true, because people cut a lot of corners in those sort of post-war years, partly out of ignorance. I mean, they were using materials that we didn't know much about, and so they were doing kind of wild things. And then 20, 30 years later, we discovered that it wasn't such a great idea, and now it's very expensive and complicated to fix some of those problems.
Well, you talk about the role of ideas
Yes.
in architecture. And, you say it's necessary to have sort of an idea, or I think you're quoting someone who said that every good building is built on some idea. But, I mean, is there sort of a moderation principle at work there? I mean, it seems like, some architects get so caught up in these ideas that they build things that are, unworkable, unlivable. I mean, I'm thinking about like the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, or the Richards building, right? Amazing building on the Penn campus, but kind of useless as a lab, which was the point of the building.
Well, I did mention, although in that chapter on ideas, I did point out that there are great buildings that don't have any ideas or have many little ideas. So, I mean, you're building like the Pantheon in Rome. It's a circular building. It has a dome. It has a hole in the top. That's the idea. And it's incredible. It's a wonderful building that architects have copied for hundreds of years. I mean, every dome building in some ways really goes back to that. And there are many buildings, with domes and holes in the top that really, I'm thinking of the National Gallery, for instance, in Washington, that great room in the middle. I mean, that's a translation of the Pantheon. So there are ideas like that, single ideas, but there are also many buildings that don't have a big idea. They have many little ideas. And what is true about architecture is that ultimately it doesn't matter about the ideas because it has to work in the real world. And architecture ultimately is a very pragmatic field. There's a quote, and I was looking up, I've known this quote for years, and it's supposedly Paul Klee who said it, but I couldn't find actually any proof that he said it. But the quote is that artists can paint square wheels, but architects have to build round wheels. And that is the difference between what we started with, an applied art and a so-called fine art. So ultimately, it either works or it doesn't work. And if it works, think of something like a staircase. It's a complicated idea, but it works. And we haven't really figured out anything better except maybe the escalator. But so so we repeat it. I mean, we don't reinvent it every time, and we don't redesign it. We design, staircases for outdoors are different than staircases for indoors. The dimensions are different. You can make a very low slope stair, which is very sort of stately. Or if you have a fire stair, there's a limit to how steep it can be before it becomes dangerous. So it's a very pragmatic field. If it works, it works, and you repeat it, and you don't worry about who invented it, or the double hung window is just a wonderful kind of window. And once people invented it, sometime not much later than the Middle Ages, probably 16th, 17th century, they give up casement windows because their double hung windows are much better in many ways and simpler, and then they just keep going, and we still use them. So I would say the ideas are less important, I think, than people, especially in schools. Architecture schools are weird because they don't actually build anything. You can't. I mean, it's just not practical. So the idea becomes very important because that's all you've got. Right? You've got a drawing, and you've got an idea, and you explain it, and so the ideas take precedence. But in the real world, where you're actually building something, the built result is much more important than whatever the idea. You can't tell a client, well, this was a great idea, but it maybe you don't like the way it works, but it was a good idea, and that would obviously not go over. So ideas, I think, are less important in architecture than certainly historians and sort of theorists make it out to be.
Well, in the books on the chair and on cars, it seems like there's this back and forth between the stylists and the engineers, right? The form folks and the function folks, right? Kind of jockeying for position. I mean, this seems like it seems like a fun discussion because obviously you need both, right? And if this debate ever stopped, then I think design would kind of grind to a halt, right?
Yes, it is interesting because certainly in the cars, there are all these examples of sort of contradictory examples. So Citroën, for example, very early. Well, let me step back. The early cars were all designed by engineers. Those you had to have engineers because these were mechanical things. They were complicated. And then when it came to designing, like, what is the shape, one engineer would just be given the job, and maybe he was talented in some way, or maybe he was the arty engineer. I don't know. But Citroën actually went out and hired an artist, an Italian émigré, a sculptor, and there are pictures. This is sort of 1920s, with clay models very early on, and.
But wait, wasn't the original Citroën designed for farmers?
Well, the deux
so
chevaux,
they could, go across.
But I'm thinking actually before the first car there was a car called the traction avant, the front wheel drive, and Citroën didn't invent front wheel drive, but they were the first company that had a sort of mass production car using front wheel drive, which got rid of that big hump that goes through the car in the older cars, and that's where they hired the sculptor to work with the engineer, and it's a beautiful car. If you ever go to a sort of French policier movie, the gangsters all drive them because they're very threatening looking. They're very low. They're also the first car with unibody construction. That's why they're so low. They don't have a chassis. The whole body works like a chassis. So they're very low. They're very fast, and they handle very well because they are so low. So they, in real life, the criminals really did like them because bank robbers and people like that could escape more quickly. And then there was the second car, which, as you point out, was designed for the completely different market, the rural market, and that's the deux chevaux. it's not actually 2 horsepower, but it was a category of the size of the engine. But that was also designed with the sculptor. So even though it was a bare bones car, it was really bare bones. You had a windshield wiper, a single windshield wiper, but it was manual because there was no battery, there was no electrical system, there was a dynamo. So when you got to a stop sign, your lights dimmed because the dynamo was not running. Windows were, in the first prototypes, the windows were made out of plastic. The roof was all canvas. I had a deux chevaux, and so I think of it very lovingly. But it wasn't so you could have a convertible. It was just cheaper. It was cheaper to use canvas, and it was lighter than metal for the roof. And once you got a canvas roof, of course, why not roll it back and open up? And the deux chevaux has that option. So yes, style and engineering are always in a kind of strange relationship, because there are also cars. The Mini is the most dramatic example, where there is actually no stylist at all. The engineer did everything. He happened to be a good draftsman, but he designed the car, he designed all the mechanical, but he also designed the way it looks. And it is actually a very beautiful little car. And that's why it lasted so long, and it was extremely popular. Or another example also from England, the first Range Rover, which I think is the classic. It's a very beautiful car. It had no stylist. It was all designed by engineers. And it was simply if you've ever seen a Land Rover, it's like a really crude Jeep. So this was simply meant to replace the Land Rover, but with a bigger car. Their Land Rover is pretty small, and they were sort of inspired by the United States four-wheel drive vehicles, and so it wasn't a fancy car. It was all plastic inside. You could hose it down. That was one of the selling points. You could, when it got muddy, because it was all plastic, and then it happened to be taken up by Swinging London, and it became a fashionable car. And then, of course, they did, you got leather seats, and you got wooden dashboards and all sorts of fancier stuff. And it became, in movies, it's always the drug lords all have Range Rovers, because that's kind of the top of the line if you want a four-wheel drive car. But it is a very beautiful car, I think. And it's much more beautiful than later Range Rovers or any of the other SUVs that have dominated cars ever since. Because somehow it has these high windows, and it has a sort of appearance that is elegant, but not kind of trying to be something it isn't. I don't know. It's hard to put your finger on it. And car design is actually, I think, a very complicated business, and it's often like an accident when you get a beautiful car. I talk about this in the book. One of the first two-seater Jaguars, it was the XK 120. 120 was the miles per hour. So this was a fast car for it was sometime early 50s. They had developed a new engine, and it was for a sedan, and the sedan was sort of behind schedule, but they wanted to unveil the engine. The engine was finished, and it was a very powerful engine for Jaguar, and so they said, well, we'll just throw together some kind of two-seater, and we'll stick the engine in it, and it was kind of a weekend project, and that was the XK 120, and it became this incredibly popular sports car. The first American to own was Clark Gable. It kind of goes to show you, I'm sure arranged with the company, but it became a really and it had this fabulous look, which Jaguar continued for a long time, which was sort of very glamorous. It was not a kind of square enthusiast's car. It was a glamorous two-seater, and it had these very sculptural curves. But again, not the man who was kind of responsible mostly for the body was an sort of aerodynamics engineer, and he worked it all out on his slide rule, and then but produced this incredibly beautiful shape, beautiful classic shape as a result. So yes, it's this styling and sort of function and mechanics goes back and forth with cars.
I mean, the thing that's frustrating about cars is their transience. I mean, I've had over a dozen cars in my life. I think I count, according to your book, you maybe had 5 cars
No, 15,
in your life.
15 or 16.
And 15. Okay, I only saw the 5 that were mentioned. And so these cars, I mean, they come and go, and you fall in love with the cars, but you have to kind of let them go. And I currently have 4 cars, and only one is actually operating. But I mean, you can have a screwdriver or a chair or a stove or a house that lasts longer than a car. I mean, cars, you can have a horse that lasts longer
That's
than
true.
a car.
But that was, that was one of the things that led me to write the book, because I realized, as you said, they don't last long, and we forget them, and then we just forget that they ever existed. And unlike buildings, which you can see the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building and all these things, unless you go to a car museum, you just don't see these things. They don't drive around the streets. So you forget them. I mean,
But for a car, to really appreciate a car, you can't just look at it in a museum. You kind of gotta drive it. Like a chair, you gotta sit in the chair to really appreciate the chair.
I never went to a car museum before I wrote this book, but at one point I felt obliged to. And you're right. I mean, in fact, you can't even sit in them. They're sort of corded off, and they are like as if they're like works of art. And it's sort of pointless just to stare at the exterior.
Yeah, I went to the Mercedes Museum recently in Stuttgart, and I've had a number of Mercedes in my life, and so I could look at the ones that I owned with more appreciation than I could look at the ones that I've never owned.
I was told a wonderful story, which I wasn't after I wrote the book. I.M. Pei bought a Mercedes, probably back in the 70s or 60s, and he loved it. It was a great car. They are great cars, and then sort of 30 years later, he just loved it too much, so he sent it back to Germany. They rebuilt it and sent it back, because they do that. I mean, they have all the parts, and that's one of the services that they offer. And I thought that was a great story, because he, as you said, he sort of overcame that problem of the car by saying, well, this is the car I want. I don't want another car. I don't want a new car. And new Mercedes, anyway, were not as good as some of the old Mercedes. So you can see, and you get used to a car. So why I love this extravagant gesture of just sent the whole thing back and told them, you make it like new. And I'm sure they did. I'm sure it was effectively a new car when you got it back.
Well, you wrote a book once called Looking Around, and I'm wondering, I mean, a lot of the design choices that are made in the different domains that you've written about, it seems like a lot of people don't notice them. I mean, if they do notice them, they notice them unconsciously. So it seems like a lot of the design effort that a lot of the trouble that people go to is wasted in a way. I mean, how would you encourage people to become more conscious of the design that's around them? How would you encourage them to look around?
It's difficult because it's sort of the equivalent of, as you said, the designer puts effort into it. But you could say that a composer puts effort into writing music. If you've never listened to classical music, you'll miss an awful lot. So it isn't a sort of automatic process where anybody should be able to immediately appreciate everything about it. I don't think that's true. And I think particularly with excellent design, it probably requires a certain amount of knowledge on the part of the onlooker, of the user, to appreciate it, and as it does in anything, any art. I mean, or actually, I mean, in guess, if you've never eaten good food, what do you know about good? You don't know anything about good food. So, you know, going to a restaurant and say, "Oh, I hate this caviar. This is awful stuff," because your taste buds have not been educated at all. So I think in so many fields that's true, whether it's and not, as I said, not just fine arts, but in gastronomy and cooking and certainly in dressing. I mean, in all kind of fields. So I think knowledge is what you need, and experience. So the more you experience something, I mean, it's pointless if you've never drunk wine, you shouldn't buy $100 bottle of wine. It'll be wasted on you. So you should start lower down, but you could certainly educate yourself about wine, and then, you know, if you want to, you can work your way up to $100 wine.
Yeah, I teach a course on the wine industry at the business school here at Berkeley, and you know, every semester we have 60 people in the class, and I would guess that maybe one, at most two, will actually go into the wine industry. But the hope is that the other 58 people, right, will learn a little bit about wine and, you know, help those other one and two to make some money, because they'll learn about how to appreciate it. And I'm wondering, you know, in our educational system, it seems like the number of people who are taking classes in, say, architectural history. When I was at University of Pennsylvania, I took a couple classes in architectural history, and they were incredibly profound. I never had any intention of becoming an architect, and yet it helped me to see things differently for the rest of my life. You've taught classes to students in business school and other parts of the university. What can people get from exposing themselves to, say, a course in architectural history, and why? I mean, do you think that enough people are doing this? Are you concerned that there aren't enough people that are getting the tools that would enable them to experience this life that they go through in a more enhanced way?
I mean, I think most students and most departments are so focused on their specialty or their major or whatever they're studying that kind of crossover doesn't happen. So, for example, if you look at the courses in the School of Architecture, you'll find they're really meant only for architects. And I would say you would be wasting your time if you went there and you weren't an architect, because they assume all sorts of knowledge, pre-knowledge, but they sort of don't tell you. So the truth is, if you look at those courses, nobody from outside the School of Architecture enrolls in them, because they're really not intended for it. So partly that's, I don't think that was the case in the past. It's certainly not the case in the art history course that you described. But in so much of the university, it all becomes specialized. I mean, in my case, I was teaching a class at the Wharton School for real estate majors and MBAs, but they were the people who were interested in development. I mean, most real estate students are not going to be developers. They're going to be lenders and borrowers and buyers. But some of them want to be developers, and they're actually like the architects, because they want to build things. And it's not actually the top rung. The top rung in real estate is to buy low and sell cheap. I mean, buy cheap and sell high. Building things is sort of not the way to get ahead in real estate. But if you want to make something, if you find satisfaction in building things, that's what attracts you. So, but I don't think people from outside the Wharton School took my course. I think my intention in the course partly is a bit like your wine course, is to make them understand what architects are trying to do, why they do what they do, and secondarily to sort of sell them on the idea that design actually makes business sense, that there are not all design, but there are aspects, there are buildings. I'm thinking of those atrium hotels, for instance, from the 70s. That was a architectural decision, but it was actually a pretty momentous business decision too, because those hotels became very popular because of these spectacular spaces in them. And if you're a smart developer, you can use, I think, design to help yourself on the business side. So, the developer, for instance, who figured out that people really like tall ceilings and it's not very expensive, that's a very smart decision because, I'm in a 12-foot ceiling. It's an industrial building. They're much nicer than 7'6" ceilings, which is what modern architects did for a long time. And it doesn't cost much. It costs a fraction of what you can charge, for instance, for a feature like a tall ceiling. And basically all housing now has at least 9-foot ceilings and maybe 10, almost as a standard. Nobody does an 8-foot ceiling anymore.
Well, Witold, thank you so much for joining me. This is a great conversation. I recommend everybody check out the new book, The Driving Machine, but don't forget all these wonderful old books, including Story of Architecture, City Life, How Architecture Works, and so forth. Let's chat again soon.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Greg.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.